When you think of consoles from the late 70s and early 80s, you might consider the Atari 2600, Intellivision, or ColecoVision. But there was one obscure console that had a very short lifespan, the Arcadia 2001. Was this console any good, and why didn't it perform well? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. Alright, we're very close to 600 members on Discord. Just go to discord.podrez.net if you'd like to join. And if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit the subscribe button right there. Alright, we're going to talk about a very obscure console, the Arcadia 2001. In the late 70s and early 80s, there were two consoles that were doing well. The Atari 2600 would set the standard for future game consoles. This was one of the first game consoles to take cartridges. It was also the first to receive arcade ports like Space Invaders and Pac-Man. The games were also getting more technologically advanced as time went on. Despite the company behind it falling apart numerous times, the console lived on until 1992. The Intellivision improved some aspects of the 2600. The graphics are a bit better, and the sound capabilities are more realistic. There was also more ROM space to work with thanks to an additional 4 kilobytes built into the console itself. Even though it never beat the 2600, the console still had a long lifespan, lasting until 1990. There were a bunch of other consoles that were released during that era, including one very obscure one. With the success of the Atari 2600 and Intellivision, an unknown company began development on a new game console. This particular company would do most of the legwork, including handling the creation of the console and later on the marketing. The company Emerson would license the product, which means their name will show up on the product and the games. With a game console created and a company to endorse it, the Emerson Arcadia 2001 was born. Emerson themselves had very little to do with the console, despite their name being all over it. The Arcadia had hardwired controllers that were similar to the Intellivision with the number pad and everything. The hardware had some noticeable improvements over the 2600. The Arcadia had 1 kilobyte of RAM while the 2600 had only 128 bytes. The 2600 could only natively support 4 kilobyte cartridges, but with bank switching you could make 8 kilobytes or even 16 kilobyte games. The Arcadia mostly had 4 kilobyte games, but there were some 8 kilobyte ones too. When looking up gameplay footage to the console, the graphics do look better than the 2600. Some games look very colorful and the sprites look nice and small. The console definitely one-ups the 2600 in the hardware department. That's not quite the case with the Intellivision though. The Arcadia does match the Intellivision's 1 kilobyte of ROM space, but in addition, the Intellivision has 4 extra kilobytes of ROM space built in, which essentially gives some games 8 kilobytes instead of just 4. When comparing the two consoles though, the Intellivision has more impressive looking games. To me, the Intellivision is the clear winner here. The boxes and games all had a similar design, with the name of the game in rainbow text and artwork below it. The artwork for a majority of these games looks bad. Looks like one of my art projects from elementary school. You would think they would try to give potential buyers a good first impression, but obviously not. The boxes don't show any gameplay screenshots whatsoever, which is not a good sign. Shouldn't you be proud of your game? There was one strategy that Emerson, or rather the unknown company, had to stick out from the competition. The Arcadia was only $99, which was less than the 2600, which was $190, and the Intellivision, which was $275. The lineup of games, which we'll see in a second, is very unique. The Arcadia received some arcade ports of games that didn't see a lot of representation anywhere else. These two things could be a great selling point for the console. Most of the games have a feature called freezing, which is just pausing. They were really proud of this, as the instruction manual would boast about it in great detail. I actually do give the company props for this because pausing was not a standard feature yet for game consoles, but they implemented it poorly. When you pause, it will repeat the last sound that was played. Yeah, that's not annoying. Some games will also let the demo play if you press a certain button. Most of the demos have a very predictable pattern. This is an interesting feature, but why not just let the demo play if the game is idle for too long? That's how normal games work. Anyway, with all this talk about games, let's take a look at some. Let's try Astro Invader. It's a unique take on Space Invaders. Enemies will fill up at the top and you have to shoot them down before they overflow. If they do, they will start falling down towards you. If they land on the ground, they will explode and they may kill you if you're near it. It seems easy at first, but in the later levels the enemies will fill up quickly. It's near impossible to keep them from overflowing. This is a decent game overall. Here's Turtles Turpin. It's a maze game where you have to save all the baby turtles and then avoid the enemies. Some of the items will drop baby turtles, while others will drop enemies that will be added to the stage. In the arcade version, every time you pick up a baby turtle, a house icon will show up on the screen and you have to go there. But in this version, you collect all the baby turtles at once and then find the exit. This iteration is actually much easier because of this difference. I'm glad this console receives Turtles because it's an underrated game. These are the types of games this console needs to stand out. Now for Auto Race. It's a basic racing game where you have to reach the end in the shortest time possible. If you crash, the game will automatically place you back on the track with some time lost. The game uses tank controls where left moves you counterclockwise and right moves you clockwise. Not my favorite, but it works fairly well here. The game is nothing special, but I respect that it scrolls in multiple directions. The Atari 2600 would not have been able to do this. Still though, it's funny to see the sides of the screen putting itself together. The Intellivision had a similar game called Motocross, but doesn't have the same screen issue and also scrolls in multiple directions. This one is way better. I'm excited to see that Jump Bug was ported on here. The arcade version is one of the most innovative games at the time. You play as a car that constantly jumps and you must make it to the end without touching the enemies. The money bags are important because if you collect enough of them, you get a free life. It starts out as an auto-scroller, but the second half of the stage features multi-directional scrolling. It's the first ever platformer to feature scrolling and the first game to have parallax scrolling with the stars in the background and the slower moving clouds. Unfortunately, the console version doesn't live up to the original. The scrolling has been removed, so now it just alternates between screens. The enemies are also completely stationary, unlike the original game where there are unique enemy patterns. Some enemies look like the money bags, which makes it harder to see where you can land on. Unfortunately, they took everything away that made the arcade version great. I thought they would have at least tried horizontal scrolling since Auto Race pulled it off, but I guess not. Let's try Cat Traxx. You play as a cat and you must collect all the dots while avoiding the dogs. It's obviously very similar to Pac-Man, but there's some noticeable differences. There's no power pellets. Instead, there will occasionally be an item that turns you into a dog catching truck. This will temporarily send the dogs to the top of the screen. You can also warp to a random spot on the screen. This can be nice if you're in a bad situation, but sometimes your new location will be worse than before. You can only warp a temporary amount of times. This is one of the better titles on the Arcadia. You might be surprised that Cat Traxx is so similar to Pac-Man until you try Crazy Gobbler. Wow, they weren't subtle about this one at all. There's not much to say. The power pellets are back, the character you play as looks just like Pac-Man except purple, and the ghosts look identical to the original game. There's a few differences like the level layout and the fact that there's only 3 ghosts instead of 4. To be fair, the game does play well, and it's fortunate for Arcadia owners that they got Pac-Man in some form. While a few of the games are decent, you can just tell by looking at some of them that they're just very low quality. The title screens for most of the games look ugly with plain text that blocks the background. For the arcade ports, most of them are missing features that make the original version great. The graphics are decent in some aspects, but also messy, and the sprites are all one color. It's no wonder why they didn't include any gameplay screenshots on the box. Unfortunately in the US, the Arcadia 2001 didn't perform well for a few reasons. Atari secured the license to many of the most popular arcade games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders, which prevented the Arcadia from getting any of them. The 2600 also had multiple companies on board, whether Atari liked it or not, like Activision, Imagic, and Apollo. These companies would give us some of the best 2600 games on the console, like Pitfall, Kaboom, and Demon Attack. The Arcadia only had a library of 47 games, most of which were developed by the company UA Unlimited. Bandai would publish 4 of their own games when they distributed the Arcadia in Japan. Some licenses were obtained, like Turtles and Astro Invader from Konami and Jump Bug from Hawaii Corporation. It seems like their strategy was to grab licenses to lesser-known games since Atari took all the others. It didn't stop them from making copycat games though. Alien Invaders is just Space Invaders, but the graphics are far worse. Space Attack is a clone of Galaxian, and it's not too bad. Breakaway is just a copycat of Breakout. This one is even harder because the ball moves way too fast right from the start. Circus is obviously inspired by Circus Atari. It's playable, and the graphics are slightly better than the 2600 version. And like I mentioned before, Crazy Gobbler is a straight up ripoff of Pac-Man. I'm surprised no one ever went after the company behind the Arcadia for the rip-off games, especially the Pac-Man one. In a similar story, Philips published KC Munchkin for the Magnavox Odyssey 2. This game was similar to Pac-Man, but with some noticeable changes to the formula. But that didn't stop Atari from taking Philips to court over it. Crazy Gobbler is even more like Pac-Man than KC Munchkin was, so why didn't Atari do anything about it? It probably wasn't worth their time. Speaking of lawsuits, Emerson would actually sue the company Arcadia Corporation, who made the Supercharger add-on for the 2600, for copyright infringement. Arcadia Corporation would end up changing their name to StarPath to avoid further legal issues. Another major problem for the Arcadia 2001 was the ColecoVision, which came out only 3 months after. This console was better than the Arcadia in every way. The console had 16 kilobytes of video RAM, which was significantly higher. ColecoVision games could hold up to 32 kilobytes of ROM space, which isn't even counting the built-in 8 kilobytes that the console itself has. Graphically, the games look way better than any home console that was out at the time. Coleco also had the license to Donkey Kong, which was a big deal. This was the best version of the game, and it was even a pack-in title. The Arcadia had no shot against the ColecoVision. The final reason for the Arcadia's failure was the video game crash in 1983. At the time, there was no quality control with video games. Companies could make any game they wanted, no matter how inappropriate or bad it was. Buying a new game at the store was like playing the lottery. You didn't know what you were getting. Consumers lost interest in video games because of this, and the industry was not profitable anymore. The Arcadia 2001 is one of the prime examples of why the crash happened. Someone who doesn't know any better might be enticed by the low price point, only to have a mediocre console with a bunch of poorly made games. You had no way of knowing either. The boxes almost never had any gameplay screenshots on the front or back. Unfortunately, the console would be a commercial failure in the US and would only be discontinued 18 months after release. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.